Hi, I hope that all those that you love and care for are staying safe and doing well. Our gospel this morning is a curious mix of both a first century civics lesson and also a first century religious studies question. So, how does it unfold? Well, it begins with a group of Pharisees. Who are the Pharisees? Pharisees, as you might recall, are powerful religious leaders who typically are in charge of religious leadership on the outskirts of Jerusalem and further in the countryside. Remember, the religious system was pretty much controlled by the temple priest in Jerusalem. So outside of Jerusalem, the Pharisees had a lot of power, and they were really essentially modern day rabbis. And they often had the power to make life difficult for other religious leaders that they saw as being unorthodox or outside of the normal scheme of things. And so when that happened, they could really make life quite dangerous for someone like Jesus, who they saw as a challenge to their own religious views. Now, not all Pharisees were bothered by Jesus. We know that he had some allies among some of the Pharisees, but not all. And in this case, we're told by the gospel writer that this is a group that find what Jesus is doing, if not a threat, they're certainly unsure of what his intentions are. So the gospel unfolds with the Pharisees who have decided to trick Jesus, and they're going to trick Jesus with a rather curious question about taxes. And the question for Jesus is going to be, is it okay? Is it ethically or morally or religiously okay to pay taxes to the Roman government? Now, as a 21st century audience, that's an easy question for us to answer. We have to pay taxes, right? Whether you're a person of faith or not. During the time of Jesus, though, the question could be a little more precarious. And that is, as you will remember, the Romans are in Israel illegally. They're an occupying force. And the state of Israel, or the kingdom of Israel, is a vassal state. And as a vassal state, the people of that state are paying extremely high taxes. Taxes, according to some scholars, that could be as high as 80 to 90% of someone's meager paycheck. And so the idea of taxes being a question to trip up Jesus for a first century audience would have had a lot of energy around it, a lot of heat around it. And of course, what they're trying to do is to trip up Jesus, right? If he says the wrong thing, he's going to anger the religious establishment, and if he says the wrong thing on the other side, he's going to threaten the Roman system, and we know that the Romans were not very kind to those who dare challenge the Roman system of government. So Jesus is going to have to thread the needle here, but the gospel writer tells us very quickly that Jesus knows what's going on. They know that he knows that he's being tricked by this group of Pharisees. And what happens next then is sort of a lesson again in religious studies and civics lessons, and Jesus is about to school these Pharisees. And so he says, well, hand me a coin. And the coin that they hand him is a denarius, and a denarius in today's currency is worth about $20. And then he holds up the coin and says, well, whose likeness is on the coin? Whose likeness is on the coin? And they respond, well, it's a Roman coin, and because it's a Roman coin, it's going to have the likeness or the silhouette of the emperor. And that's very true. Roman coins had the insignia of the Roman authority, the emperor, as well as what stamped on one side of the coin, a silhouette of the head of the emperor. And so then Jesus says, well, okay, give to Caesar, or give to the emperor, that which belongs to the emperor, and then give to God that which belongs to God. There, I've answered your question, right? And what maybe we're expecting next is for the Pharisees to not like the answer, because after all, they're there to trip Jesus or to trick him, and they actually think that his response is really good. But why is it good? Because it seems really confusing, I think, right? At least on the first read of this. It almost sounds like Jesus is trying to have it both ways, right? Is it okay to pay an illegal occupying country like the Romans? And at the same time, is it okay to still be in relationship to God in the midst of all of that? So upon further look, what we discover is that the prevailing sort of belief at the time, the prevailing theology at the time for Jewish leaders, for Jews of all kind living in Israel, primarily was the belief, and I think of an important belief, that everything in the world belongs to God. That everything in the world is touched by God's grace. And everything in the world functions as it does with God's permission. And so when Jesus responds by saying, give to Caesar, or give to the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and give to God what belongs to God, what he's really doing is saying, okay, the emperor is going to get his due, the Romans are going to get their due, but remember, they're getting their due only because we know that God is still very much part of this world. And if the Romans are here, they're only here because God has allowed that to happen. There is really this very radical sense then for Jesus that you can give whatever you need to the Roman authorities, but what the Romans don't know, but you and I do know, he's saying this to the Pharisees, is that there's something that is even more powerful than them. There's another emperor, there's another Caesar that they belong to. They may not know it, but they do. And that to be patient, because this emperor, God, will not always allow the Romans or any other power to trample on God's people. Give to the Romans what's the Romans, kind of as a wink, that's temporary, reading between the lines. Give to God what belongs to God. And what belongs to God is trust. Trust that God is going to, in God's good time, take care of the Romans. That God is going to continue to be with God's people. And on another level, and I think perhaps on the most important level, what the gospel is saying to us, I believe, is, hey, know what you're rooted to. Know what you belong to. Understand what is the most important cornerstone in your life. That there's so much that goes on in life, so many difficulties, so many things that are out of our control, so many injustices that we see, so many difficulties. And it's enough, I think, at times to want to give up. It's enough at times to wonder, is God present anywhere? Does God even care? Has God left the building? But I think what Jesus is saying here is trust. Trust that the sovereignty of God is still very much part of this world. And that God often, comes to us in waves of subtlety and in waves of silence, but nonetheless, in the most powerful way possible. Know what you belong to, Jesus seems to be saying. What's your cornerstone? How do you keep going in the midst of great difficulty? Well, you keep going by knowing that God is with you, even in things that we do not understand. I'll end with this. Over the last 4 or 5 weeks, I've had the opportunity to serve as celebrant for 2 weddings, and these weddings have involved former students of mine. And what I've loved about these weddings is, first, it's been great to see my students after so many years. But in both cases, both weddings were pared down. At one point, both of these weddings were going to be very big weddings, big indoor church weddings. But of course, with COVID, they had to pare them down and reduce them to very small numbers outside. But what I love is the decision of both of my students to say, look, in the midst of all of this, right, COVID is going to be COVID, but my love is stronger than any fear or any challenge or anything that brings me anxiety, right? I know what I'm rooted to. And in this case, I will reduce everything that I need to. I will strip it all away, right? So that we are reduced just to the things that are most important to me. Small family, couple of friends, and I will get married, and in the midst of those vows, what I will say to the person that I love is that more than anything in this world, the most important thing is this moment with you. The most important thing is love. The most important thing is this relationship, right? And I think very much these weddings have been tied in many ways to these Gospels. What are you rooted to, right? Give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God's what is God's, right? And in the midst of this COVID season, as we continue to struggle with anxiety, as we continue to struggle with the unknown, more than ever, I think we are being asked to understand, what are we connected to? What are we called to touch as a touchstone? What sustains us? And I believe that these marriages are, in many ways, a sign of what we're called to be rooted to. We're called to be rooted to each other. We're called to continue to love each other. We're called to continue to be there for one another. In the midst of things that we do not fully understand, the one thing that we can continue to understand is our care and concern and love for one another. Render unto the state, render unto all the things that we cannot control, render that to that power, but render ourselves, all the good parts of us, the parts of us that sustain us, to the people that we love. Amen.